Yes. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the things that happen at a community level study of ecology. So we're going to be looking at communities, specifically species interactions is going to be the primary focus of this video, and a touch upon biodiversity. Okay. So first and foremost, I must define a couple things. First, I must define a habitat. So habitat's probably a word you've heard before. You probably have a general sense for what it means. In an ecological context, we're talking about the space that a species lives within and the conditions of that space. So if a squirrel lives in the hole of a tree, that's that squirrel's habitat. If that squirrel can live in a snowy hole, but not a sunny hole, like those are the conditions of its habitat. Right? If the squirrel can live in a forest, but it can't live in a desert because there's no trees with holes in the desert. Yeah. That's what we're talking about when we talk about habitat. That plays into an important idea of what we call a niche. Right? And so a niche are the specific conditions under which a specific group of organisms thrive. And no two organisms within the same ecosystem can utilize the same niche. Eventually, they'll compete to the point where one of them dies off. Okay. So it's an exclusivity competition principle thing. Okay. Niches and habitats. The other word I have to start off by defining is biodiversity. And biodiversity is just how many different kinds of organisms there are in an ecosystem, how different that area is. And so let us look at some of the interspecies interactions that occur within communities. And now these are specifically interactions between two different species. Inter, right, between, not intra, which means within. This is inter, between. So this is occurring between two different species. So the first that we have is a very simple one. We have predation. Right? And so predation is when one organism eats another organism to gain energy. So the predator eats the prey to gain the energy out of that prey. That's predation. Okay? The second is parasitism. So parasitism is a relationship between two organisms where the parasite is benefiting by harming the host. Examples of this would be like a tapeworm inside of your body. It's getting nutrients by stealing those nutrients from you. The tapeworm is the parasite, you are the host. Parasite gains, host is harmed directly by that parasite. Another example is the bug that bites the tongue off of the fish and then lives as that fish's tongue. Right? So there's a bug comes in, bites the fish tongue off, and then it just lives in that fish's mouth and it eats some of the fish's food. Right? That fish didn't like that. That fish is harmed, but the bug is chilling, having a great life now. Right? Then we have commensalism. So commensalism is an interaction between two different species where one of those organisms is benefiting from that relationship and the other one's completely neutral. Not helping, not harming, just chilling. And so an example of this is there are some birds that hang out on giraffes' heads. Right? So the bird lands on the giraffe's head, it looks around, and it finds food, it flies down, eats the food, goes back up and lands on the giraffe's head. It's not helping the giraffe, but it's not hurting the giraffe either. Like the giraffe don't care that the bird's on its head. It's chilling, don't care. Okay? So the bird's benefiting and the giraffe is neutral. Commensalism. And then we have good old-fashioned mutualism. And that is when both organisms benefit from the relationship. Okay? And so an example of mutualism is bees and flowers. Right? So the bees come and get the nectar from the flower, they get the nectar, yay, and the flower uses the bee to pollinate other flowers. Flower's happy, bee is happy, everybody's happy, mutualism. Okay? And then just a little bit more about biodiversity and its importance within a community. right? So now if you think about interactions, right, that I was just describing, if you don't have a lot of different types of organisms, you can't have a lot of different types of interactions, right? You also don't have a lot of different options for how your ecosystem is going to function. And the more biodiverse your ecosystem is, the more resilient it's going to be. So if all of your organisms in an ecosystem really like water, and then all of a sudden there's a drought, your entire ecosystem is going to die off. Whereas if you have some organisms in that ecosystem that do well in drought conditions and some that do well in hurricane conditions and some that do well in mediocre conditions, regardless of what conditions hit, your ecosystem is going to survive. Right? So diversity helps fend off any kind of change within an ecosystem. So the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is, the stronger it is effectively. There are three types of biodiversity. There's genetic diversity, and that occurs on the organism level, right, or the population level. And so how mixed is any given population, right? So if I have 200 gooses, sometimes called geese by normal humans, if I have 200 geese in a pond ecosystem, and 50 of them are red, and 50 of them are blue, and 100 of them are yellow, that population is more diverse than a population that is 100% red. Okay? So that's genetic diversity. Species diversity is what it sounds like. How many different types of species do you have in your ecosystem? Right? Do you have a bunch of different plants, a bunch of different animals, a bunch of different algae, a bunch of different protozoas, a bunch of different birds? Did I say animals? Birds are animals. So a bunch of different fungi. Right? The more you have, the larger your diversity level, the more resilient the ecosystem is going to be. And the last is the ecosystem biodiversity, right? And so in an area, do you have a bunch of different types of ecosystems, or you just have one big uniform ecosystem, right? Like, do I have a bunch of marshes next to a bunch of ponds, next to a bunch of forests, next to some mountains, next to the ocean? Or do I have one big ass prairie that just goes and goes and goes, it's just grass everywhere, right? The former was diverse versus the latter was not diverse, okay? And again, the more diversity you have, the more resilient you are, huh? That's it. Bye.